Connected Patient Experience, 3 success stories on how to do it right. On behalf of Becker's Healthcare, welcome and thank you for joining us. Before we begin, I'm going to walk you through a few quick housekeeping instructions. If you have any questions throughout today's webinar, you can type those into the QA box you see on your screen. You will also find a few engagement tools on your dashboard. Please check out our resource section and also make sure you fill out our survey afterwards. We will have 2 poll questions during today's webinar. When we get the polls up, the questions will pop into the slide box and you will be able to submit your answers directly on the screen. Thanks in advance for your participation. Today's session is being recorded and will be available after the event. You can use the same link you used to log into today's webinar to access that recording. Lastly, if at any time you're having trouble with the audio or video, please try refreshing your browser first. But if you have any technical questions at all, just put them into the QA box and we're happy to help. At this time, it's my pleasure to introduce our presenter. Kristen Jacobson is the Vice President of Marketing and Omnichannel Engagement at RevSpring. Kristen is responsible for product management, marketing, and brand development at RevSpring, and brings a unique perspective to healthcare financial communications, having spent 25 years in a wide variety of marketing and product management roles with leading consumer experience technology organizations. Kristen has conducted numerous speaking engagements for HFMA, Becker's, and HFI Institute, and has been published in Becker's Hospital Review, Fierce Healthcare, TMC, and HFMA, as well as other leading industry publications. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Kristen, for the presentation.
Thank you so much. And I want to first just start by welcoming everyone who's taken the time to spend about an hour today just going through a topic that we're pretty passionate about at RevSpring around what we call a connected patient experience. This is one of the themes that we've been talking about for about the last 2 years, and there's a lot of sort of focus in the industry looking at different perspectives of what that means to be connected. We are a proud partner of Class Research and spend a lot of time with their research analysts. And they've published quite a bit in terms of direct market research that talks about how provider organizations are looking at ways that they can consolidate the vendor experience. So really looking at ways that you can use fewer communication and engagement vendors and application vendors to really accomplish more. So a lot of great insights and research with our friends at Class if you're looking to do kind of more discovery after this event. We also do at RevSpring a lot of our own research directly with patients, and of course we talk to our customers and prospects as well. But when we survey patients every few years, we always ask about how they feel about a cohesive and consistent and personalized patient experience. And it also always scores very high in terms of what our consumers are looking for in terms of their experience with providers. They're really looking for kind of that branded, cohesive experience that they see with other retail organizations in the market, and we hear that all the time. And then we've recently spent some time with about 15 revenue cycle and patient experience leaders working with our friends at Becker's. And that topic, too, focused in on a connected patient experience. And I was really delighted to hear about how many leading healthcare organizations are really focusing in on a connected experience, not just from a vendor standpoint, but also looking at what that means to the patient and how they kind of see you from the outside looking in and what that means from a loyalty standpoint. So we're just going to walk through today a little bit about what we mean by a connected patient experience and what we perceive the value is to your organizations about really focusing in not just on remarkable experiences at point solutions, but how that end-to-end experience can really be remarkable for your patients, and then what really the value is to your organization at creating that experience. So if we move to the next slide, just really high level, again, focusing in on what is a connected patient experience. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about 3 real-world examples. So we have 3 customer examples who have really taken the approach of thinking about the patient experience holistically and stitching together an experience that makes sense, where one sort of part of the care journey and the engagement journey connects to the next, and what that has driven from a value standpoint within their organizations. And then just close with some tips about steps that you can take, both from the organizations that we talk about, as well as just some tips and tricks that hopefully you can take into your organizations to continue on your journey of thinking about a connected patient experience. So on the next slide, just really thinking about the kind of the conflicting challenges that we see in the healthcare market, and why it's so important really to focus in on some things that really start to reverse or repair some of the challenges that we're seeing in the healthcare market. One, as we all know, bad debt is on the rise, has been for many, many years, and patient volumes and revenues, I would say, are shifting, right? There's definitely a trend in the healthcare market more towards ambulatory types of services, retail types of services, which makes it, a little bit of an additional struggle for our health system organizations as they look at declining volumes and revenues. So the competition landscape is just a little bit different, really coming out of COVID and since. And then always collecting what we're owed from patients continues to be kind of a challenge. And how do we focus in on making that patient experience more connected so the financial conversations kind of make more sense? Deferred care expectations, so kind of on the clinical side, what are the patients experiencing? We've definitely seen trends towards patients maybe delaying care, which is, of course, something we don't want. If a patient either is resistant to care, or maybe has fear about the financial obligations of care, that can result, or a poor experience with the provider, that can result in sort of some hesitancy around seeking care that they so desperately need. Decline in loyalty, or really a focus on loyalty, is another way to think about that, which is really kind of the next sort of pyramid of how we think about revenue. So, as in any organization, if we acquire a consumer, if we acquire a customer, we want to make sure we keep them coming back. So how do we think about that pressure, and what can we do to diminish the, kind of the competitive issues that all organizations are facing? And then just the real challenges of the labor supply and increasing costs with inflation and the overall cost to collect, the reduced labor market. I hear the statistic all the time that you can, as a non kind of clinical professional in healthcare, you can go make more McDonald's than you can in a health system. And how do we kind of compete with those pressures in terms of how our very important staff workers are seeking employment? So we're really looking at these sort of pressures in the market, and what are ways that we can look at connectedness to remedy some of these pressures. And you'll see in this slide we have the words digital transformation. We're really looking at this as a digital imperative, right? How do you use technology alongside the good people that work in your organization to enable things like self-service, to think about cohesiveness in a patient experience, to think about access to self-service, so that we can match patient expectations and consumer expectations with the other conflicts that we're experiencing in the healthcare organization. So on the next slide, we really want to think about the ways, the kind of the pillars that we can focus in on as it relates to how we build that remarkable experience. So we want to think about consistency, not just in terms of kind of the stages and the technologies that patients use, but also all the things and areas that they interact with within your organization, and how we make sure that that can be one branded and connected experience. So certainly, this is a report from Press Ganey that we've summarized in kind of one simple slide. And really the overall messages here is, once that clinical quality has been established, right? So that's kind of job one. We need to make sure as an industry that you're able to provide the best possible care to your patients through, high quality caregivers, certainly a focus on how we are courteous and respectful and personalized in how we deliver care, which has long been sort of the focus of the healthcare industry. And once we have that foundation, how do you think about patient experience and consumerism as sort of those extra bells and whistles that can really differentiate you as a brand, and also cement that loyalty with patients to keep them coming back to your facility. So that's things like, with the workforce that we do have and the challenges that are facing them with, having to accomplish more of the people work because there are fewer of them. How do we make sure that we offset sort of the human work with good automation, good self-service tools, so they can keep focusing on the patient and less on kind of those manual tasks? So there's care quality, there's staff and workforce engagement, so they can be happy employees and really focusing on providing great service to patients. And then there's the overall process. So how do we think about, and this is really where we're going to focus most of our time today, how do we think about that overall sort of experience process from the time the patient finds you or comes back to your organization as a consumer, as a patient, and how do we think about all those steps along the way from the time that they first hit your website to the time they schedule an appointment, come through your facility in terms of the intake process, all the back-end systems that work to support understanding that patient and enabling that care, all the way through the point where they're paying for that service. How do we make that one experience and not just a collection of good experiences? How do we really think about cementing loyalty by making that one large, integrated, connected, branded experience for patients so they keep coming back? So on the next slide is just kind of an example of how we think patients are too often experiencing, all the things that they need to interact with when they go to receive care. And we know this is the experience because we talk to patients. We know this is the experience because we talk to many providers who are saying this is the exact problem that they're trying to solve. We have many, I think we went too far to the poll. If we can go back to great, thank you. If you think about all, and this is not even conclusive of all the things that patients will, during their time as a patient in your organization, will have to interact with. So there's price shopping, there's scheduling of the appointment itself, there's the registration process, kind of the administrative aspects of that. Maybe you're providing estimates, maybe you're doing payments up front, certainly the financial experience. It's highly likely that in that ecosystem, there are many vendors that are providing that experience, which in and of itself is not a bad thing, right? But when you think about the overlap that you potentially have, I always think about, some of the things that we do as a business, where, we're sending email and text communications and we're enabling phone communications. And there's certainly other applications, whether through EMR directly or other engagement applications that are somewhat doing the same thing. There's a lot of overlap there, right, in terms of the tools and technologies that you have available to engage your patients. There are also probably some gaps, right, where you have to, from a manual standpoint, kind of think about how to connect that experience because the technologies and the data sources that support them just are inherently disparate. So that's kind of the internal pain points of that, but then there's also the patient experience. So if we're not kind of thinking of all these steps along the way as being consistent, and how does one step relate to the next, and how do we kind of set patient expectations as we move through that continuum, how is the patient really perceiving their experience with the organization so that it's consistent and remarkable? So we'll go to the next slide, which is the poll, which it looks like the slides are wanting to do anyway. and just give you a little bit of a chance to comment on what we've talked about so far. And just would love to get a sense of, within your organization today, how many different companies do you work with? How many vendors are you working with today to complete the patient's journey, similar to the one that I just showed on the previous slide? And we'll just give everybody a minute to comment on that poll. All right, so not unexpectedly, most are responding that it's 7+, closely followed by 4 to 6, and we have some star performers that are today using, only a handful of vendors to accomplish everything we saw on that slide. So, I think what that represents is that we're definitely seeing a shift today. A lot of organizations are, working with their EMR vendors who are doing more and more to consolidate that patient experience, moving beyond kind of clinical into more kind of non-traditional engagement. Certainly, I think organizations are doing a better job of thinking about, even if you have multiple systems, how to make sure that they talk to each other and the data sources integrate. So I love to see that there are certainly providers out there that are, moving closer to that promise of more consolidated solutions. So if we go to the next slide, I just want to kind of focus in a little bit more on the problem before we start talking about the solution. So, we've talked a little bit about vendors. We've talked a little about technology. These are just some of the things that I think are kind of the obvious blockers, the things that are standing in the way of really providing that more cohesive experience. Technologies are disparate. That's kind of a no-brainer. If you have different systems, you certainly can work as an organization by doing things like, customer experience mapping and journey mapping to kind of think about intentionally how you tie those experiences together. But it does require more, sort of intentional thinking about that experience if inherently those technologies aren't connected to each other. The more technology you have, obviously the more deployments you have, the more integrations you have. So it does tend to add some kind of lethargy to your technology implementations, which by nature should be fueling and accelerating your performance. But, multiple systems and integration options, certainly can weigh us down and slow us down. And IT staffs are certainly one of those pain points in terms of where you just don't have enough people or enough resources. Certainly just the cost side of capital and resource intensive technology investments. It's very difficult. The one in the kind of in the center of this slide that talks about low or no touch point personalization is really one of my favorites. When we think about creating an experience that's very personalized to a patient, and you don't have connection between the different stages of their experience, it's very difficult to act on what you've learned from that patient with prior engagement. One of the things that we hear from our healthcare organizations is that we work with is something as simple as consent management. So you likely have all sorts of systems where a patient or a customer has provided you with their email address or their phone number and given you some sort of permission to use that digital asset. If that's locked in multiple systems, it's very difficult to share that across the patient experience, and you lose sight of what those patient preferences are because you can't make that consistent from touch point to touch point. That's just one example of what we mean by low or no touch point personalization. We talked a lot about staffing shortages and the challenges there. Metrics can be very difficult to come by in terms of how you really measure satisfaction and performance and outcomes if you're trying to cobble that together from different systems. And you'll see an example of that in one of the case studies we go through today. And then just scalability, right? If you're scaling something as a whole versus having to kind of keep all those different solutions and resources and STEP, it just is inherently more of a challenge to kind of keep everything aligned as you scale your organization. So if we move on to the next slide, this is an example of what we mean when we think about really providing not just a connected experience, but a personalized experience that is really focused on the view of the patient and how they think about all the things that they need to interact with when they work with your organization. So here we see two different patients, and you'll see by the color coding that they are taking some of the same steps. So, for example, to go back to the previous slide, looks like the slides are maybe progressing themselves. So we can go back to the slide with it. There we go. So in this instance, pre-care messaging. So both of those patients are going through that stage of the journey, but they're going through it in a different order. So we really need to think about not just making things like pre-care engagement exceptional, but how does that relate to the steps that they've already taken, and how does that relate to the steps that they're beginning to take? And one of the things that we've heard a customer of ours talk about is, I want to be able to provide that remarkable experience, not with just one vendor, but with as few vendors as possible, right? So how do I get to the point where I can provide the best experience and the most consolidated experience and the most cost-efficient experience for patients with as few vendors as possible? So if you move to the next slide, just to focus on what we're going to talk about today in terms of our 3 customer examples. So we're going to walk you through the first 2 are examples of ambulatory care organizations. And as we know, we've seen a lot of shift during COVID and kind of coming out of COVID, where healthcare consumers are looking for more of that ambulatory and maybe retail experience for a number of reasons. The aging population, certainly requires more access to care often than the younger adults, and it becomes sometimes easier for them to kind of in an ongoing way manage that care by using, accessible ambulatory facilities. Certainly, it can be more of a cost-efficient sort of an option. Telemedicine has driven some of that, and just the convenience of telemedicine and the ongoing demand for kind of convenience from a consumer standpoint. So those of you who are joining us today who are in that ambulatory space can certainly look to these organizations and how they're thinking about that consolidation as cues of things that you can take into your organization and hopefully put into practice to really help solve some of the challenges you might be having in terms of cost and staffing and patient experience. But they're also great cues for health systems as you understand kind of what your competition is doing. And we also have a rural health system example, which is, I think, just a great example of how to do more with less as we look at really what's happening with the rural health market and the closures and the consolidations we've had there, given kind of the extreme challenges they have to kind of keep up with the larger healthcare organizations. So that's what we'll kind of walk you through over the course of the next 20 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up for questions. So if we go to the next slide, our first customer is leading orthopedic pain and physician management network. So they are large. They have more than 120 locations and 750 medical professions and 1 million patient visits a year. So if we go to the next slide, we'll just focus in on a little bit of the challenges that they were seeing when we were first introduced to this organization. One of the primary things that they really focused on was they had too much technology, right? They were using too many different vendor solutions to provide the services and the experience that they wanted to provide to their patients. And that was kind of job one when it came to how they wanted to focus in on really reimagining the patient experience in this organization. They had a lot of inbound calls. The volume was high, and they also had a challenge with appointment cancellations. So making sure that their patients were engaged was a high priority, and using technology to do that engagement as opposed to human-to-human contact was a priority of those as well. They were seeing, as many of us are in the organization or in our organizations, that print and mailing costs are continuing to rise. Not only the cost of the goods that are required to print and mail communications, but also the USPS continues to increase the rate. So sending a communication in the mail is certainly becoming more important or more of a challenge. We will show you an example actually in this case study, though, where you can continue to use print and mail strategically, and many patients prefer that. And in honoring those preferences, we want to make sure we can use print really more strategically where it makes sense to patients and not sort of as a blanket approach. And then they just recognized overall that their patient experience was subpar to what they were seeing their competitors doing in the market. So the next slide, I think, is probably the simplest and my favorite in the overall slide deck, because the reason that we were introduced to this organization is that one of the leaders in their organization, C-level leader in their organization, received a communication in the mail, happened to be a printed statement, and his experience with that communication really got him to thinking about what the overall patient experience was that they were providing in their organization. And just something as simple as a printed statement, but just how personalized it was, the use of technology, even in that printed communication, the ability to scan a QR code and connect directly to self-service options for payments, the fact that the payment options were personalized to him, and once he moved to that payment experience, it was very connected to the communication in a way that he hadn't seen before. He essentially said, we need that experience for our patients. And that was really what triggered their search for a better patient experience. And ultimately, we've had the pleasure of being able to work with them to help re-architect that experience. So this is just kind of underscores the fact that every communication matters and really does serve to kind of deliver those remarkable experiences that patients are looking for. So if we go to the next slide, we'll give you a little bit of a sense of what that experience looks like for the patients of this orthopedic organization today. And we'll do that by using a fictitious patient, and his name is Joe. So Joe's journey working with this orthopedic organization starts before he even enters the door. And what this organization is doing is providing a good faith estimate that they provide to their patients so they can, before they even engage with the organization, understand their financial commitment and really prepare to pay for that financial obligation even before they receive that service. So it's really setting those financial expectations up front. And then he's also able to kind of pre-register. So all the information that he would need to provide to the organization in order to register them into for that procedure, he's able to do in a digital way before he even enters the organization. So once that appointment is set, Joe receives an appointment reminder, and he's able to do that in the channel that he most prefers. So through the process of intake, that pre-registration process, he's had the ability to really specify what channels he is most interested in interacting with and for what purpose. And through that same message, we'll say it's an email communication, a text communication, he can actually interact with the staff through that channel. So if he receives his appointment reminder through a text and he has a question, without leaving that same channel, without leaving that same interaction, and he has a question, he can link in with the staffing organization to get any additional information and questions answered that he has. So his procedure is a hip injection. So he goes in, he has his procedure, and following that procedure, he receives a statement for his responsibility. And it just so happens that Joe is a print person, and his response to that payment request is via paper. He also receives email and text reminders, so that one communication, that printed communication, is not the only communication that he receives. It's just the primary communication because that's the way he prefers to receive his information. And we do see in behavior, we see in patient survey results, that print does really need to continue to be an important part of your engagement strategy, because there are patients that do still prefer that as a channel, perhaps for an estimate, maybe for pre-care instructions, and often for payment communication. It's just really the magic is to find the right mix of communications for each patient so that you can offset some of those costs that we're seeing with rising print and mail, and also deliver the experience that patients are expecting. And even though it's a printed experience, it's still a digital experience. As you saw with the statement previously, there's a QR code on that statement. They can scan it with their phone, and Joe can easily go in and make a payment, digital payment, that's completely tailored to the estimate that he saw and the payment options that he was provided up front, so that whole process is consistent. So, the thing to think about as you look at Joe's journey is that wasn't architected by multiple different leaders in the organization and by multiple different vendors. That was created holistically as one process, as a streamlined experience for patients like Joe. So if we go to the next slide, we can talk a little bit about the results that this organization has been able to see. One is yield improvement. So they were able to increase dollars paid per month from about $750,000 to over $2.75 million a month, just by making the payment experience more precise and personalized, and also simpler for patients like Joe. A lot of that is due to digital engagement. So even though digital wasn't the right option for our fictitious patient Joe, it is the right option for a lot of patients. And what this organization opted to do was, rather than rely on specific opt-ins to the portal to receive digital communications, they've adopted a digital-first approach where we utilize the digital assets that they have available to engage patients first with digital, and then provide them with printed options if they don't respond to digital, which has the benefit of reach in terms of digital engagement going from we see typically about 10% to 15% of patients will actually opt in to receive digital communications for billing and payment, just based on the nature of payments in healthcare, whereas we can typically reach about 90% of patients with digital if we use a digital-first approach. And then with that comes a great patient experience, because we're honoring kind of the channels that they actually engage with, but we're also able to offset some of those costs of print and mail by using less printed communications for those patients who don't crave them. So if we go to the next slide, one of the things we like to share, we talk a lot about the benefits to healthcare organizations, and those are more obvious to us every day, right? But we also talk to patients. We get calls in our call center. You get calls in your call center. And if you have a way to survey patients as part of the patient experience, you can also understand what the investments you're making and the time that you're taking to think about how to make those experiences more remarkable. It's always rewarding to hear what patients are saying about that experience. So I won't read these to you, but I will read you the last one, because I think it's just a remarkable comment. This person suffered a stroke and admitted that things like this are difficult, engaging with financial and technology, and that this process made it very simple for this particular patient, which is just what we're always looking for. So next example, if we could progress the slide, is also an ambulatory organization focused on urgent care. This is an organization in Texas, and they have 44 clinics, and they are a rapidly expanding urgent care organization. So if we move to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about the challenges that they were experiencing when we came to be acquainted with this organization. Their business started to really accelerate during COVID. As we saw, urgent care centers became popular as there were many restrictions in health systems with limited bed capacity and such things. It really was kind of the initial impetus for a shift to more ambulatory services. And this particular organization saw growth during COVID and needed to be able to scale and then really maintain that growth once the pandemic began to subside. They had particularly challenge around staffing and hiring, very much a brick and mortar, multiple facility type organization. So that staff presence in each and every facility was a challenge for them. They too wanted to think about how to consolidate vendors. In fact, this was the client that said they wanted to provide the best possible patient experience and solution managing the least possible amount of vendors. And this is when I hinted at this one a little bit as well. Most technology solutions that you purchase will have great data, right? And some analytics that are tied to that particular point solution. But one of the things that we see with a lot of providers, they also want to pull that data and mine that data to integrate into their own reporting. And that was true of this organization. And they found that very difficult to do with the vendors that they were working with currently. So if we move to the next slide, we'll give you a little bit of sense of what the patient experience looks like for this urgent care organization. And we'll tell that story through the eyes of Mary, who is a patient who needs an urgent care experience because she's stepped on glass and she needs stitches. So the first step of Mary's journey is she wants to make an appointment and she wants to do it online. She doesn't want to talk to a human. So we've enabled this organization to be able to do that. If she wants, she can also, from that same experience while she's making the appointment, through a consolidated visit portal, receive an estimate for what that visit is going to be. And during that time, she can also fill out any pre-service forms that are going to be required for her once she is in the office for that appointment. So things like address information, insurance information, digital consent, any pre-service, even payments can be done. And this is one of the main drivers, main features that this organization wanted to implement was, how do I make that intake process as hands-free as possible for our staff and make it as simple and integrated as possible for my patients? So Mary is able to, through that pre-service process, take a picture of her driver's license, take a picture of her insurance card, so not even enter any information. That's OCR'd, so it's automatically input into the system. If she wants to make a prepayment, she can store that card, so it's easy for her to make a payment in the future. And all of that is within one experience. And that experience can either be done at home before she even leaves for the office, for the doctor's office, or she can do it once she reaches the urgent care facility. Once she reaches the facility, anything she hasn't completed pre-appointment, she has the ability to do before the appointment, including making a copay. And one of the things that this organization is really pushing towards is accelerating the payments to that pre-service experience. That doesn't always mean prepaying for the appointment. One of the things that they're adopting is the ability to set up what they call an auto pay. So the patient can go in, they can store their card, they can agree to a predefined amount based on that estimate, and then once they've received the care or procedure, once that statement drops, they don't have to go in and set up anything. We already have a stored card, we have all the digital assets, so that auto payment can be made with a very simple approval. So again, just looking at ways that we can streamline the patient experience by thinking about all of those kind of disparate applications that we tend to think about as different experiences into one integrated experience. So if we go to the next slide, we can look a little bit at the results that this organization has seen. So I think this is what this company would say is the most remarkable ability that they've had through the use of really streamlined integrated technology. And that is they've been able to increase, actually I think this stat is on the next slide. They've been able to, if you go to the next slide, reduce staff from 4 to 1 for calls, and they've been able to scale their organization and experience their growth without adding any additional staff. So I'll have you go back to the next slide. I'm sorry, I'm jumping around a little bit. But so automated intelligence has allowed the billing team to not reduce is probably the wrong word here, but kind of repurpose staff. You know, I like to think of it as staff augmentation, not staff replacement. So how do we use technology to do more with the good people that we do have? Wait times for registration have been reduced. Patient calls have been reduced. That was one of their key pain points. One of the big advantages of the automated intake process I described, where we're not requiring patients to enter information, type in information, possibly mistype or misremember information, but scan it and through OCR technology automatically input that into forms and pre-populate those, has an impact not just on patient experience and staff augmentation, but also just accuracy. So just the accuracy of the data has improved. If you go to the next slide, they've received a $4 per patient increase, and that may seem like a small number, but this is a big win for them. A $4 increase in collections prior to the visit, and then just continuing to innovate in terms of enabling self-service for the patients. So I'll have you go to the next slide, and we'll talk a little bit about what this particular organization is saying about that experience. Again, I won't read the full slide to you. You certainly can read the quote directly, but I think the big takeaway here is using the opportunity of that intake process and the technology that the patient has in their hands for that intake to get the information, excuse me, from patients that we're going to need downstream. And in this case, it is getting a card on file from patients so that ultimately the payment options are as simple as just saying pay now because I have all the information from the patient. So we'll go now next to our last example, which is a rural healthcare organization. I love this example, and RevSpring has really made an intentional decision to focus both products and services and our attention on the rural health market. As we all know, they're experiencing the challenges in the market exponentially, given the nature of their business. There have been far too many closures of rural health systems in the past 20 years, and I was just reading an article in Becker's just recently about the fact that there are 220 rural health organizations across the U.S. that are in danger of closing in all but of 7 states, right? So this is a problem that we're passionate about focusing on in terms of how do we help rural health systems improve the patient experience, but also think about how to use technology and resources more efficiently. So this is one example of where we've done that for a health system in Ohio. So if you go to the next slide, I'll give you just a little bit of detail about this organization. So they're a 99-bed acute care system, again, in Ohio. They have a skilled nursing facility. They have assisted living capabilities. They focus on home health, emergency transport, as many of the rural organizations do. And they also provide outpatient services as well. So truly an integrated network in a rural health setting. If you go to the next slide, I think this is my favorite quote for this particular organization. When you work in rural health, everybody knows everybody. So you're not just providing service to patients, and of course we all care about patients, but these are your neighbors. Right? These are the people that you see at the grocery store. These are the people that you go to church with. These are the people that you interact with on a daily basis. So the standards become higher, at least in the words of this organization, for how we deliver care, and also autonomy. So conversations like, what can I afford for my health care, become a little bit more uncomfortable if you're having that conversation with somebody you know personally. Other challenges were no-show rates, high no-show rates. I thought this was interesting. We tend to think of rural settings maybe being less progressive from a technology standpoint, but their patients were actually complaining about the fact that they didn't have access to some of the same digital tools that the larger health systems had. They had multiple payment portal systems that they were looking to consolidate, and little insight into what their patient experience was and what some of the trends and results they were experiencing. So if you go to the next slide, we'll give an example of what this health system experiences through a patient called Allie, who is having a baby. So, again, thinking about that as one holistic experience, we need to help make it very easy for Allie to make appointments in an automated way for multiple checkups during her pregnancy. We want to make sure that we're automatically triggering reminders so that she's able to keep on top of those appointments. Digital forms are something that this health system is using, again, to really automate that intake process, make sure that we have the best available and most accurate information for Allie, and the staff doesn't have to go in and manually key in all that information. If any new information is required for Allie, she only has to update that. She doesn't need to go in and fully fill in the same paper forms that she's filled in before. And then because it's a recurring type of an encounter, because it's a pregnancy, managing her care and payments through an integrated portal where she has constant access to those statements and balances and preference information about digital communications is always very easy for her to access. So if we go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about results. So one of their pain points was no-show rates, and they've been able to reduce that through consistent digital communications by almost 3%. Self-serve payments, because we've consolidated that and made it easier to connect the engagement experience to payments, have increased by 47%. They've had phenomenal success at reducing paper statement volume and saving costs there, which has been very beneficial to the cost operations of the organization. And then just simple things like cutting a few minutes off of every activity for their staff has allowed them to really kind of keep pace with the demands of their patient population. So if we go to the next slide, we have some quotes, I think, from both patients as well as the provider about, really what that experience has been. And really the consistency you'll see from the two ambulatory examples that we showed, as well as this rural health system, is really just that ease and convenience. Everything's clear, consistent, and connected so that experience is easy for patients to navigate. So just in closing, just a couple more slides and things for you to think about as you take away some of the points into your organization. If you progress to the next slide, please. I think we have one about building trust. So just a lot of things that you can think about, and that hopefully these points came across clearly as I was going through some real life provider examples, but thinking about messages being consistent and how one communication relates to the next communication. So really being intentional about kind of that path that patients are taking and being consistent about how we're using communication. digital experience that's easy and streamlined. That one's kind of a no-brainer. I think all of us are focused on that. Precisely tailored to each patient. So use what you know about patients to drive those journeys and tailor the messages. And use those clues that you see from patient behavior to use the right channel the next time you see them and integrate with them. Think about, I think if we've talked about nothing else today, really focus in on how you think about all of those interactions. And healthcare is hard, right? And, I love when you go to conferences and they talk about wanting the Amazon experience or wanting the airline experience. They had the advantage of building that experience from the ground up with one system and kind of one team. Healthcare is just different. We're sort of newly applying some of those trends to what today is the reality of very disparate systems and data sources. So it's a heavier lift, but we can certainly get there with intention and focus. Respect patients' time, and really think about all of the interactions with the patient the same way you think about that clinical experience and make that just as remarkable. So the next slide, what can you do to create a connected experience? Understand your patients. Mainstream the intake process. So really think about, that's a great way. I think all of our examples have shown how you can automate that intake process to make it easier for patients, and it's a great staff delighter, less administrative overhead and fewer errors. Connecting that experience, pre-care connects to post-care, and we should think about it that way. Drive as much self-service as possible, and then empower your staff for every communication. So I think we're going to skip the last poll question. Actually, let's do the last poll question. Go ahead and go to the last poll question, and then we can go ahead and take questions. So the last poll is, after seeing these examples of a connected patient experience, how close would you say, or where, maybe a better way to ask that is, how far are you on the path to achieving this goal? So we certainly saw that most on the call today are still experiencing the reality of multiple disparate systems, but on your journey towards, thinking about how to make that cohesive, where are you on that journey? So about 33% haven't started yet. Halfway there. That's great. I think we're kind of seeing that in the numbers where we're seeing a shift. Probably the 66% are those that are, doing a good job of thinking about vendor consolidation. And not surprisingly, nobody feels they're truly there in terms of delivering that connected experience, which is not surprising given, I think, how kind of, I've really seen this kind of change in a meaningful way in the last few years, and it will take time, but I'm really excited to share some great success stories with you all. So we'll go ahead and open it up to questions. Anything that's come in is fair game. Go ahead and fire away.
Great. Well, thank you for that, Kristen. Our first question is, what are some of the logical technologies that work best together to start the vendor consolidation process?
I think probably the best example is, like I said, I think we had it a couple times, at least in two of the case studies we shared, is the intake process. I think today is still so manual and so paper-driven, and honestly a dissatisfier for patients. When we do a patient survey, that was one of the things that they commented most on, of being still kind of clumsy and awkward for them in terms of what they'd like to be more of an automated experience using their mobile device to enter information rather than having to kind of take the clipboard and enter that information. So for that reason, it's a good thing to focus on. And it's a really great thing to connect to the payment experience, because that's one area that you have the attention of patients to kind of gather all that information and share it within your other systems. So if you're using that opportunity to digitize and gather digital consent, email addresses, mobile addresses, verify address information if you should need to mail them. Get a card on file so that you make that payment experience downstream, whether it's an automated payment or whether you're enabling things like text to pay. If we can use that intake process and connect it to what you're doing from an engagement process for payments, that's a really big win in terms of delighting patients, being more kind of careful with staffing time, and increasing payments, which is beneficial to everybody.
Great. This next question is a two-part question. The first part is, do you integrate with Epic? And the second part is, how about integrating the pharmacy experience within the healthcare experience?
Yeah, so the answer is yes. So we will work, we do work with Epic. And Epic, a lot of the things that I've talked about today, Epic is definitely on that path as well. They are, I think, one of the great leaders in terms of thinking about how to make the patient experience, kind of consistent and integrated and intuitive, which requires kind of a different philosophy, I think, from vendors to think about not how do you replace what Epic is doing, but how do you augment and sort of fit into the nooks and crannies of things that maybe Epic doesn't do today or doesn't do yet. So, we definitely do integrations with Epic clients and have a number of different ways to do that so we can, continue to uphold that seamless experience that Epic is, so passionate about, and we're so passionate about, even in a multi-vendor environment. Pharmacy is something that we absolutely have an expertise in. We work with a number of organizations, health systems that have an integrated pharmacy. We can use a lot of the same engagement capabilities that we would for the clinical experience itself. A lot of the same reminder technologies for refills. A lot of the same automated payment capabilities. AutoPay is kind of a huge winner of an application for recurring refill prescriptions. You can do things like, automate prescription refills. So we certainly do and have thought about how that integrates into an overall care experience for health system organizations.
Thank you for that. And unfortunately, it looks like that is all the time we have for today. I want to give a special thank you to Kristen Jacobson for the excellent discussion and also to RevSpring for sponsoring today's webinar. If you had a question that didn't get answered, don't worry. Someone will follow up with you shortly after this webinar. Thank you for joining us again today, and we hope to see you at a future Becker's webinar. Have a good one.
Thanks, everybody.